The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the sprawling slopes of Silver Pines Ski Lodge in pristine white. The air was frigid, biting against skin and numbing fingertips, yet inside the lodge, the scene was one of cozy warmth. Golden light spilled from frosted windows, the hum of conversation and laughter drifting softly through the halls, and the faint melody of piano music echoed like a haunting lullaby. Ethan Blake stepped into the grand lobby, brushing the snow from his tailored black coat. The contrast of the warmth inside and the freezing cold outside struck him like a wall. But he barely noticed. His sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the massive stone fireplace where families gathered, the holiday wreaths hanging from every doorway, and the couples sipping wine by candlelight. For anyone else, it might have felt magical, Christmas at its finest, but not for Ethan. To him, the festive decor and forced cheer were hollow, just another reminder of what he didn't have. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his dark gray sweater and exhaled deeply. He wasn't supposed to be here. He hated places like this, too soft, too romantic, too filled with happy families and their picture-perfect lives. But his assistant had practically forced him to take this trip. "You need a break, Mr. Blake." Somewhere quiet, no meetings, no phones. And for some reason, he'd agreed. The truth was, he felt empty. Decades of success as a venture capitalist had brought him wealth beyond imagining. Yet no amount of money could fill the silence that crept into his penthouse every night, or the shadows of old memories that haunted his dreams. Memories of a life he'd buried years ago. "Merry Christmas, sir," a cheerful receptionist chirped as he passed. Ethan nodded vaguely in return, his thoughts elsewhere as he wandered toward the bar at the far end of the lodge. The music grew louder with every step, a soft, delicate melody that tugged at something deep inside him. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful. Ethan paused at the entrance to the bar, his eyes searching for the source of the music. And there she was, a woman seated at the grand piano, fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys. Her silhouette was elegant, bathed in the warm glow of a hanging light. Long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, partially obscuring her face as she played. But it wasn't just the way she looked, it was the way she played. The music was alive, filled with longing and sadness, as though the piano itself were weeping. Ethan's heart clenched painfully. It couldn't be. The melody, the one she was playing, he knew it. Before we dive deeper into this mysterious story, take a moment to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. And tell us in the comments, do you believe in fate? Or is it all just coincidence? Let us know below. Ethan's feet felt rooted to the ground as he watched her. For a moment, the sounds of the bar, the clinking of glasses, the quiet murmurs of patrons faded entirely. All he could hear was the music. It was soft yet powerful, each note dripping with emotion. And then she looked up. It was only for a moment. Her gaze flickered toward him briefly before returning to the piano, but Ethan's breath caught in his chest. Those eyes, they were unmistakable, deep, dark, and filled with secrets. He knew those eyes. The memory struck him like a fist. Elizabeth. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. It wasn't possible. Elizabeth Foster had been gone for 10 years. Dead, buried. He had grieved her, mourned her. But here, in this winter lodge, was a woman who looked so much like her that his entire world tilted on its axis. The music slowed, and the final notes lingered in the air like a question waiting to be answered. The small crowd applauded politely, breaking Ethan's trance. The woman, Clara, as the bartender whispered her name, stood and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before disappearing into a hallway behind the stage. Ethan couldn't move. His heart was pounding, his palms sweating. He had to know the truth. "You okay there, sir?" The bartender's voice startled him. Ethan glanced over, forcing a smile. "Who's the pianist?" he asked. Trying to sound casual, the bartender shrugged. "Clara Evans. She's been playing here for a couple years, keeps to herself, doesn't talk much. Talented, though." Clara Evans, Ethan repeated the name silently, but it didn't sit right. It felt wrong, like a mask, hiding something beneath it. Ethan spent the rest of the evening at the bar, his drink untouched. He kept glancing toward the hallway where Clara had disappeared, debating with himself. Am I losing my mind? He wondered. But no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, the feeling wouldn't leave him. Finally, he stood and walked toward the hallway. The soft hum of the piano still lingered in his ears, pulling him forward like an invisible string. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep without finding out more. The hallway led to a back exit, where the cold mountain air rushed to meet him. Clara was there, leaning against a wooden railing and staring out into the night. The soft glow of a cigarette flared as she exhaled slowly, her breath turning to mist in the frigid air. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward. That was a beautiful piece you played tonight. Clara turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Thanks. Her voice was low, soft, and it sent a jolt of recognition through him. Ethan took another step closer. Where did you learn to play like that? Clara glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Does it matter? It does to me, Ethan replied, his voice firm but gentle. Clara studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and wary. You're not here for the music, are you? Ethan shook his head. No, I'm here because I think I know you. For a split second, something flickered in her expression, shock, fear, or maybe recognition, but she quickly hid it. You don't know me, she said flatly, turning back to stare at the snow. Your name isn't Clara, is it? Ethan pressed. Clara froze, her hand tightening around the cigarette. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Elizabeth, he whispered. The name left his lips before he could stop it. Clara turned sharply, her eyes wide and unguarded for the first time. What did you say? Your name. Elizabeth Foster. She stared at him, her face pale, her breath quickening. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the wind whistling softly through the trees. Finally, Clara whispered, I don't know who you are, but you need to stop. I know it's you, Ethan said softly, stepping closer. You might not remember me, but I remember you. Clara shook her head, backing away. You're wrong. Her voice was trembling now, her composure slipping. If I'm wrong, Ethan said quietly, then why are you running? Clara stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ethan alone in the cold. The next morning, Ethan sat by the lodge's cafe window, nursing a cup of black coffee. The world outside was serene, the snow-covered slopes coming to life as skiers glided effortlessly down the trails. Yet, Ethan couldn't focus on the beauty around him. His thoughts were consumed by Clara, or Elizabeth, as he was now convinced. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was impossible to ignore. But the deeper question lingered. If she was Elizabeth, how had she survived? Why was she here, living under a different name? And why did she act as though she didn't know him? Ethan's determination hardened. He needed answers, but he couldn't rush this. Clara was guarded, and pushing her too hard might drive her further away. He decided to tread carefully. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the bar. The atmosphere was livelier this time, with holiday travelers unwinding after a day on the slopes. The piano stood empty, but Ethan knew Clara would appear soon. He settled at a corner table, ensuring a clear view of the stage. A few minutes later, she entered, dressed in a simple black dress, her hair tied loosely. Clara moved with quiet grace, avoiding eye contact with the patrons as she made her way to the piano. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before she began to play. The first note hit Ethan like a jolt. It was the same melody she'd played the night before, and this time, he let himself feel the weight of it. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was raw, filled with pain and longing. Every note seemed to tell a story, one Ethan couldn't yet decipher, but felt inexplicably connected to. As the performance ended, Clara stood and gave a small nod to the audience before slipping away. Ethan waited until she was out of sight before rising from his seat. This time, he was determined to talk to her without interruption. Ethan found Clara in the same place as before, the small wooden balcony behind the bar. She was leaning on the railing, staring at the snow-covered trees in the distance. The cigarette she held trembled slightly in her fingers. "You played that piece again," Ethan said, his voice breaking the quiet. Clara turned her head slightly, recognizing him. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You again?" she muttered, flicking the cigarette into the snow. Ethan stepped closer. "I need to know the truth," he said firmly. "Why do you look like her? Why do you play the same music she used to play?" Clara crossed her arms, her expression a mix of irritation and discomfort. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't do that," Ethan said, his voice softening. "Don't lie to me. I know it's you, Elizabeth." Her reaction was subtle, a slight intake of breath, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was enough. "You've got the wrong person," Clara said quickly, stepping back. Ethan took a deep breath. "If I'm wrong, then explain this." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was an old picture of Elizabeth, smiling at the camera, her hair falling in loose waves around her face. Clara froze. Her eyes darted to the phone, then back to him. "That's not me," she said, but her voice wavered. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his phone. "It is you. I don't know why you're pretending otherwise, but I deserve to know the truth." Clara's composure finally cracked. She looked away, her hands gripping the railing tightly. For a moment, Ethan thought she might break down, but when she turned back to him, her face was hardened. "Leave me alone," she said coldly, brushing past him and disappearing into the lodge. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his room, piecing together fragments of the past. He scoured old articles about Elizabeth's disappearance, rereading the details he thought he'd buried years ago. Elizabeth Foster, a rising pianist, had vanished after a tragic car accident on a snowy road. Her car had been found mangled at the bottom of a ravine, but no body had ever been recovered. The authorities had ruled her dead, and her family had held a funeral. But now Ethan was questioning everything. What if she hadn't died? What if the accident had been staged, or worse, part of something much darker? The following day, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He approached the lodge manager, a cheerful woman named Karen who seemed to know everyone. "Clara Evans," Ethan began casually. "She's the pianist here, right?" Karen smiled. "Yes, she's wonderful. Isn't she? We're lucky to have her. How long has she been here?" Karen tilted her head thoughtfully. "A little over 3 years, I think. She showed up one day, asked for work, and we hired her. She doesn't talk much about herself, though." "Did she ever mention where she came from?" Ethan pressed. Karen hesitated. "Not really. But sometimes, I get the sense she's running from something." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Karen shrugged. "Just little things. She doesn't like having her picture taken, avoids giving out personal information. And her music, there's so much emotion in it, like she's carrying the weight of the world." Ethan nodded, his suspicions growing stronger. He thanked Karen and left, his mind racing. That evening, Ethan attended Clara's performance again. This time, he sat closer to the piano, watching her every move. As she played, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small key hanging from a chain around her neck. It was simple, unremarkable, but Ethan recognized it instantly. It was the key to Elizabeth's childhood piano, the one she had kept as a memento after her parents sold the house. Ethan's chest tightened. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was her. After the performance, he waited for Clara outside the bar, determined to confront her one last time. When she appeared, he stepped forward, blocking her path. "We need to talk," he said firmly. Clara sighed, exasperated. "I told you, you've got the wrong person." Then explain the key, Ethan said, pointing to the necklace. Clara's hand instinctively went to the chain, her eyes widening. Where did you get that? Ethan demanded. Because I know where it came from. Clara stared at him, her face pale. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. Clara's hand trembled as it rested on the small key hanging around her neck. Her usually guarded expression faltered, replaced by something Ethan hadn't seen before, fear. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her eyes darting between him and the ground, as if weighing whether to tell the truth or run. You need to let this go, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head. I can't. You're Elizabeth. You're the woman He stopped himself, swallowing the lump in his throat. You disappeared, and I need to know why. I need to know what happened to you. Clara's gaze dropped to the snow at her feet, her body tense. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed and turned toward the railing, her hands gripping the wood tightly. I don't remember everything, she said softly. Sometimes, I think I do, but it's just flashes, a sound, a smell, a face, but they don't connect. Ethan took a cautious step closer. What do you mean? Clara hesitated before speaking again. There was an accident. I remember the crash, the sound of glass breaking, the cold. Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head as if trying to shake off the memory. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. They said I'd been unconscious for days, that I was lucky to be alive. Why didn't anyone tell me? Ethan asked, his voice cracking. Why didn't your family? Clara's bitter laugh cut him off. My family? She said, turning to face him. Her eyes were cold now, her tone sharp. The same family that buried me without ever finding my body? That wrote me off as dead and moved on like I never existed. Ethan was taken aback. They thought you were gone. They didn't look for me, Clara snapped, her voice rising. She stopped herself, taking a deep breath to regain control. Or if they did, they didn't try hard enough. I woke up in a hospital with no name, no memories, and no one looking for me. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. None of this made sense. Elizabeth's family had been devastated by her loss. He remembered the funeral, the tears, the grief. How could they have given up on her so easily? What happened after the hospital? He asked carefully. Clara looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the key around her neck. I spent weeks there, trying to remember who I was. The doctors said I had retrograde amnesia from the trauma. Eventually, a social worker found me a place to stay, a convent in Pennsylvania. The nuns there were kind, but I didn't belong. I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I was just lost. Ethan's chest tightened at the thought of her alone, abandoned, while the people who loved her mourned her death. And the key? He asked, nodding toward the necklace. Clara touched it gently, her expression softening. I don't know why I kept it. It's the only thing that feels familiar. Like a piece of me I can't let go of. I don't even know what it opens. Ethan hesitated before speaking. It opens your piano, the one you had as a child. Clara's eyes widened slightly, her breath hitching. For a moment, she looked as if she might cry, but she quickly composed herself. That doesn't prove anything, she said defensively. Clara, please, Ethan said, stepping closer. If you don't remember, let me help you. There are people who can piece this together. Medical experts, investigators. No, Clara cut him off sharply, her voice filled with panic. She backed away from him, shaking her head. You don't understand. I've built a life here. I don't want to go digging into the past. It's better this way. Better for who? Ethan demanded. You've spent years hiding, running from something you don't even remember. How is that better? Clara's face hardened, and she turned to leave. Just leave me alone. Ethan. Ethan watched her go, his heart heavy with frustration. He couldn't force her to confront the truth, but he also couldn't walk away, not now. Determined, he decided to take matters into his own hands. The next morning, Ethan made a call to a private investigator he'd worked with in the past, Michael Harrington. If anyone could dig up the truth, it was Michael. "I need you to look into someone," Ethan said, pacing his room. "Her name's Clara Evans, but I think it's an alias. She might be connected to Elizabeth Foster, the pianist who went missing a decade ago." "Clara Evans?" "Got it," Michael replied. "Do you have any other information? Address, workplace?" Ethan gave him the details, including the lodge's name. "And Michael, this stays between us." "Understood," Michael said before hanging up. Now, all Ethan could do was wait. Later that day, Ethan was sitting in the lodge's library, pretending to read, when Karen, the lodge manager, approached him. "Mr. Blake," she said, her tone cheerful. "I hope you're enjoying your stay." "It's been eventful," Ethan replied with a small smile. Karen hesitated before continuing. "I couldn't help but notice you've been spending a lot of time around Clara. She's a wonderful musician, isn't she?" "She is," Ethan agreed cautiously. Karen lowered her voice, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I don't know if it's my place to say this, but Clara's been through a lot. She's a private person, but sometimes, when she plays, you can feel it, like she's carrying a heavy burden." Ethan nodded, his suspicion growing. "Do you know anything about her past?" Karen shook her head. "Not much. She mentioned once that she doesn't have family, but she didn't elaborate. Honestly, I think she came here to escape something." Ethan thanked her and excused himself, his resolve strengthening. Clara might not want to face her past, but Ethan was determined to uncover it, for her sake as much as his own. That evening, Michael called back. "Ethan, you were right," Michael said, his tone serious. "Clara Evans doesn't exist, at least not before 3 years ago. Everything about her is fabricated. But here's where it gets interesting. There's a missing persons report from 10 years ago that matches her description. Elizabeth Foster." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What else did you find?" "Elizabeth's disappearance was strange," Michael continued. "The accident was ruled an act of nature, but there are inconsistencies in the police report. Witnesses reported seeing another car near the scene, but it was never identified. And get this, Elizabeth's father, Richard Foster, shut down the investigation after a week." Ethan frowned. "Why would he do that?" "Your guess is as good as mine," Michael replied. "But if I had to bet, I'd say there's more to this story than meets the eye." The revelation from Michael weighed heavily on Ethan. If Clara truly was Elizabeth, then her father, Richard Foster, had deliberately ended the search for her. But why? What kind of man would abandon his daughter and let the world believe she was dead? Ethan's frustration simmered as he paced his room, replaying the details in his mind. Clara's insistence on burying the past wasn't just fear, it was survival. Someone had wanted her gone, and the crash was no accident. Ethan knew confronting Clara again was risky, but he couldn't let her slip away. That evening, after her performance, he waited by the piano. The crowd thinned, and Clara began packing her music sheets. "Clara," Ethan said softly. She stiffened but didn't look at him. "I told you to leave me alone." Ethan stepped closer, his tone gentle. "I don't want to hurt you. I just want to help, but I need you to trust me." Clara finally turned, her expression weary. "Why can't you let this go?" "Because I care," Ethan said earnestly. "I've already uncovered things you deserve to know. The accident, it wasn't an accident. Someone tried to hurt you." Clara froze, her breath hitching. "What are you talking about?" "Your father," Ethan said cautiously. "He ended the investigation after the crash. He didn't look for you." "Why would he do that?" Clara's face paled. She sank onto the piano bench, her hands trembling. "That doesn't make sense." He wouldn't do that." Ethan sat beside her, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know why, but I'm going to find out. You deserve to know the truth." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then she whispered, "I'm scared." Ethan, what if I'm not ready for the answers? Ethan reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. You don't have to do this alone. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Ethan's words replayed in her mind, stirring fragments of memories she'd buried for years. She remembered the crash, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, and the cold. But there was more, something just beyond her reach. She closed her eyes, letting the memories come. A voice, her father's, sharp and commanding. You've ruined everything. Elizabeth. The words were vague, but the anger was unmistakable. Her eyes snapped open, her chest tightening. Why couldn't she remember the rest? The following morning, Clara found Ethan in the lodge cafe. She approached cautiously, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag. I'll talk, she said quietly. But not here. They walked to a secluded spot near the edge of the property, where the snow-covered trees offered privacy. Clara leaned against a tree, her breath visible in the cold air. I've been trying to piece things together for years, she began, but it's like my memories are locked away. Every time I try to remember, it hurts. Ethan nodded. What do you remember? Clara hesitated. I remember the accident, the cart spinning out of control. But before that, I was arguing with someone. My father, I think. She paused, her brow furrowing. He was angry, yelling about something. I don't know what. Ethan's jaw tightened. Do you think he was involved in the crash? Clara's eyes widened. No, he wouldn't, would he? Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Your father had a reputation for being controlling. If he thought you were a threat to his plans, Clara's voice trembled. He loved me. He might have been strict, but he wouldn't hurt me. Would he? Ethan didn't answer, his silence louder than words. Later that day, Ethan received another call from Michael. Ethan, I dug deeper into Richard Foster's financial records. Michael said, there's something you should know. Around the time of Elizabeth's accident, he transferred a large sum of money to a private investigator. I tracked the investigator down. Turns out, he specializes in covering up messy family situations. Ethan's stomach dropped. You're saying he paid someone to hide her disappearance? It's possible, Michael said grimly. But here's the kicker. There's a record of a second payment, made about a month after the accident, to a private hospital in upstate New York. My guess, Elizabeth didn't die in that crash. She was taken there. Ethan felt a surge of anger. So he knew she was alive. He let everyone believe she was dead while keeping her hidden? That's what it looks like, Michael confirmed. Ethan hung up, his fists clenched. He needed to confront Clara with this, but he had to do it carefully. That evening, Ethan found Clara sitting by the fireplace in the lodge's library. The glow of the flames illuminated her face, making her look both ethereal and vulnerable. I found something, Ethan said, sitting across from her. Clara looked up, her expression wary. What is it? Ethan hesitated before speaking. Your father paid to have you taken to a private hospital after the accident. Clara's breath caught. What? Why would he do that? I don't know yet, Ethan admitted. But he didn't tell anyone. He let the world think you were dead while keeping you hidden. Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, that can't be true. He wouldn't. Think about it, Ethan pressed gently. Why else would he end the investigation so quickly? Why else would he transfer money to cover it up? Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't understand. Why would he do this to me? Ethan reached out, placing a hand on her arm. We'll find out. Together. As Clara tried to process the revelation, Ethan remembered something Michael had mentioned. A letter. There's one more thing, he said. The investigator I hired found a letter your father wrote to someone shortly after the accident. I think it might have answers. Clara looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and fear. Where is it? It's being sent to me, Ethan replied. We should have it by tomorrow. The next morning, a courier arrived at the lodge with a plain envelope addressed to Ethan. Inside was a copy of the letter Richard Foster, had written shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance. Ethan opened it carefully, his heart pounding as his eyes scanned the neatly written lines. The letter was addressed to an unnamed recipient and was brief, but its content was damning. "I've done what needed to be done. She is safe and will remain out of the public eye. Do not contact me again. Payment has been arranged." Ethan clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. The letter didn't explain why Richard had taken such drastic measures, but it confirmed his worst suspicions. Richard Foster had orchestrated Elizabeth's disappearance. He turned to Clara, who sat silently by the window, her face pale as she stared at the falling snow. He handed her the letter. "This is what I found," he said softly. Clara took the letter with trembling hands. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then finally to anger. "He knew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He knew I was alive and he kept me hidden?" Ethan nodded. "It looks that way. The hospital, the payments, it was all him." Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Why? Why would he do this to me?" Ethan sat down beside her, his voice calm but firm. "That's what we need to find out. Whatever reason he had, it wasn't to protect you, it was to protect himself." Despite Clara's initial hesitation, she agreed to confront the past. Ethan arranged a visit to Richard Foster's estate, located just a few hours away. As they drove through the snowy countryside, Clara remained silent, her hands tightly gripping the key around her neck. When they arrived, the sprawling mansion loomed ahead, cold and unwelcoming. The sight of it sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Memories she couldn't fully grasp flickered in her mind. Fragments of her father's stern voice, the sterile smell of his study, and the suffocating weight of his expectations. A butler opened the door, his expression neutral as he led them to the library where Richard waited. The man was older now, his hair silver and his face lined with age, but his presence was as intimidating as ever. "Clara," Richard said, his voice measured, as if he'd been expecting her. His gaze shifted to Ethan. "And you must be the one who dragged her into this." Ethan stood tall, his voice steady. "She deserved to know the truth." Richard's lips curled into a cold smile. "The truth? And what truth do you think you've uncovered?" Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "You lied to me. You let everyone think I was dead while keeping me hidden. Why? Father? Why would you do that?" Richard exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. "You were never supposed to come back," he said, his tone laced with regret. "I did what I had to do to protect our family." Clara's brows furrowed. "Protect us from what?" Richard's gaze hardened. "Your actions put everything I built at risk. The night of the accident, you were threatening to expose me, to ruin me. I couldn't allow that." Clara's eyes widened. "Expose you? For what?" Richard hesitated, then admitted. "There were business dealings, things you didn't understand. You found out more than you should have, and you thought you could use it against me. I couldn't let you destroy everything." Clara took a step back, her face pale. "So you tried to kill me?" Richard shook his head. "No, the crash was an accident. But when I saw the opportunity to make you disappear, I took it. It was easier than facing the scandal you could have caused." Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "You're saying you sacrificed your daughter's life for your reputation? That's disgusting." Richard's expression didn't waver. "You don't understand the weight of responsibility. Sometimes, sacrifices must be made." Clara's hands trembled as she absorbed her father's words. The man she had once admired had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. "You're a monster," she said, her voice barely audible. Richard's face remained impassive. "I did what was necessary. You wouldn't understand. You never did." Clara's anger flared. "I was your daughter. I trusted you, and you threw me away like I meant nothing." Richard stood, his cold demeanor finally cracking. "You were going to destroy me." "What I did for the family, for the legacy I've built. And look at you now, a pianist in a ski lodge, clinging to a life you don't even remember. You should be thanking me for giving you a fresh start." Clara's fists clenched, tears streaming down her face. You didn't give me a fresh start, you stole my life, and I will never forgive you for it." The confrontation ended with no resolution. Richard refused to apologize or admit fault beyond his cold justification, and Clara walked out of the mansion, her heart shattered. Outside, Ethan followed her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't need him," he said softly. "You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for." Clara wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. "I don't want anything to do with him. He can keep his legacy. I'm done with him." Ethan nodded. "What now?" Clara looked down at the key in her hand, her expression thoughtful. "I want to find myself again. Not who he wanted me to be. Not who the world thought I was. Just me." The two returned to the lodge, the snowy landscape quiet and serene. Clara began playing the piano again that evening. But this time, her music was different. It was lighter, freer, as if she was finally releasing the chains of her past. Ethan watched from the bar, a bittersweet smile on his face. He knew Clara's journey was far from over, but she had taken the first step toward healing. After her performance, Clara approached him, her expression soft. "Thank you," she said simply. Ethan shook his head. "Oh, you don't need to thank me. I just want you to be happy." Clara hesitated, then gave him a small, genuine smile. "Maybe someday I will be." As she walked away, Ethan felt a sense of peace. Their paths had crossed again, not to rekindle a lost romance, but to help each other find closure. The camera panned to the snowy mountains outside, the faint melody of Clara's piano lingering in the air, a symbol of hope and resilience. Clara sat alone by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames flickering against her face. Her fingers toyed with the key around her neck as if it were a lifeline, tethering her to the fragments of a past she was only beginning to confront. Ethan had stepped away to give her space, but his words lingered in her mind. "You deserve to know the truth." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to fully feel the weight of her memories, not just the accident or her father's betrayal, but the smaller, hidden moments that had slipped through the cracks. Closing her eyes, she let the sound of the crackling fire wash over her, pulling her into the depths of her thoughts. Suddenly, a vivid image surfaced, a room filled with warm sunlight, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, and the sound of a piano. Clara saw herself as a young woman, seated at the piano bench. Behind her stood her father, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. "You'll thank me for this one day." His voice echoed in her mind. The memory shifted. Growing darker, she saw papers strewn across a desk, financial reports, contracts, and something else, a letter. Her father's name was scrawled at the bottom, next to a logo she didn't recognize. Her chest tightened as another voice, her own, cut through the haze. "This isn't right, and you know it." Clara's eyes snapped open, her breathing ragged. She didn't know what the letter had said, but she could feel the importance of it, the weight it carried. It wasn't just about her father's business dealings, it was the key to everything. The realization hit her like a wave. Somewhere, buried in the fragments of her memory, was the truth she had been searching for. And it wasn't just about her. It was bigger than her, bigger than Ethan, bigger than all of them. Clara found Ethan in the lodge's library, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. She approached him quietly, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. "There's something I need to do," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Ethan turned, concern etched across his face. "What is it?" Clara hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "I think I'm ready to find out the rest. I don't know what it means yet, but I want to try." Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. "You don't have to do it alone." She managed a small smile, her first genuine one in what felt like years. "I know." As the camera panned out to the snowy mountains and Clara's silhouette by the piano, her fingers began to play a haunting melody. It was different this time, still tinged with sorrow, but now infused with something else. Hope. "What if the past isn't something to run from?" Clara's voiceover asked. "What if it's the map to finding who we're meant to be?" As the music faded, The screen transitioned to a soft overlay of Clara sitting at the piano. "What do you think?" Ethan's voiceover asked. "Would you confront the past, even if it meant facing the people who hurt you the most?" Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next.